Welcome back to the show. Great to have you with us. Well, recent census data shows that Indigenous children make up more than half the children in Canada's foster care system. In the fight to rectify this inequity, it's impossible to understate our next guest's impact.
Cindy Blackstock is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada and a champion for the rights of Indigenous children and families in this country. It's a real privilege to have her in studio with us today to discuss this pressing issue. Cindy, welcome to the social.
Well, thanks very much for having me. Really excited to be here. Cindy, let's start with this. The very first call to action from the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it called upon the government to reduce the number of Indigenous children in foster care. As we sit here today, how would you assess the progress made on that call to action?
Well, first of all, First Nations kids are about 17 times more likely to be in foster care than other kids. And you can draw a direct line back to the trauma residential schools. And the other thing many Canadians aren't aware of is that on First Nations Reserve, the federal government funds those public services, but far less than every other Canadian. So not only do you have the trauma, you have less ability to be able to deal with it. We're starting to make some progress there now, because we brought a court case along with the Assembly of First Nations, and that is starting to force the federal government to give these children a fair chance to grow up in their families. But there's still a lot more to do.
A lot more. To address the gross lack of resources and funding for the First Nations children, you actually filed a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, but that was back in 2007. It wasn't until 2019, a full 12 years later, that the federal government was then ordered to pay $40,000 for each First Nations child that was impacted by the racial discrimination. That settlement is still being finalized. What we want to know is, can you give us a sense of the recipient? Who is that recipient who will be receiving that money?
You know, it's so important for us to think. We can talk about what this discrimination is like. It's really about when the government doesn't think a child is worth the money. And that's where this discrimination came for First Nations kids. We had families where the federal government would cap the number of feeding tubes. Can you imagine? No. You have a child, and a First Nations parent had to decide, am I going to rewash this feeding tube and risk infecting my child, or am I not going to feed my child? Now, these feeding tubes would have been provided as needed to a non-Indigenous kid. We had children with learning disabilities who ought to have been able to access learning things, but they weren't able to. So what did they do as children? They started to think, I'm stupid. I'm the problem. And children without access to mental health services, the multi-generational post-traumatic stress that comes from residential schools. And it's no wonder why we see, tragically, some of the highest suicide rates among First Nations children.
Well, when you think about the intergenerational trauma caused by this discrimination, it seems impossible to put a dollar figure on it. But I do think it might be hard for some people to sort of wrap their heads around exactly how billions of dollars will help this. So spell it out for us. How do you see this money as helping the people that need it?
Number one, we need to look at the funds. 20 billion of that is to fix the problem. Is to fix the depth of the inequality. And even then, we're not going to get at things like, can you believe it? We still have First Nations kids that are growing up dreaming of a glass of water. Right? Like, we need to address these inequalities across the board. That's number one. Let's give these families access to the services everybody else takes for granted so that they can actually have a chance to really grow up healthy and proud. The second is, how do we remedy the injustice of those who are already hurt? And you're right, $40,000 for a lost childhood. Some of these people actually died, never knowing what it is for the government of Canada to treat them equally. Even in Canada's non-compliance, they were ordered to fix this in 2016. The tribunal linked it to the deaths of two 12-year-old girls who were denied mental health care. But for these victims, it's an acknowledgement that something happened. And hopefully it's going to be more than that. Hopefully we get Canadians who are going to say that, you know what, we care enough with you to stand in the winds of discrimination with you, because we believe in a Canada where no child is told that you're not worth the money.
Cindy, while we have you here, We have to ask you about Bill C-92, and this bill was recently challenged by Quebec, and the case is currently being considered by the Supreme Court of Canada. What do we need to know about it?
Well, what you need to know about it is that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were best cared for when under those laws by those communities. And then we had residential schools, which was the trial of the non-Indigenous governments to try and take over the care of our kids. We all know how that ended.
Yeah.
What this act is supposed to do is affirm those traditional laws. But there's a shortcoming. There's no obligation of the federal government or provincial governments to fund those traditional laws. So we all got to watch for that.
Yeah.
But what Quebec is saying is, no. We have jurisdiction over your kids. And that's what's going to be decided in the Supreme Court. We have the Quebec government saying they still want to look after our kids, even in the wake of residential schools. That's why this case is so important. We need to affirm the ability of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples to look after their kids. It's something that's fundamental to Canadian society.
Which is wild because the language here is interesting because Quebec is challenging Bill C-92 using it, the explanation that it's unconstitutional.
Yeah.
That's right.
So let's say the Supreme Court, has a judgment in favor of Quebec.
Right.
What does that mean then for the rest of the provinces and territories?
Well, then that would set a very dangerous kind of legal precedent where we're actually rolling back any kind of reconciliation, that TRC #1 call to action the survivors asked us to do. And it's sending a message that these non-Indigenous governments, even those who perpetrated such horrendous harms, are the ones that should be caring for our kids. So I'm feeling optimistic that the Supreme Court's not going to make that mistake. But we all need to watch on that because this is really, really important.
Yeah.
Looking after your kids and raising your kids in a way that they can feel proud of their ancestors, in a way that they can feel like they have some positivity in the future, that is just a fundamental human right. And when you have courts saying, maybe you don't have that right, even after hundreds of years of colonialism, that's a problematic thing.
Yeah. Cindy, throughout your career, you have witnessed the impacts that public pressure can have on decision makers firsthand. So what for people listening, what should public pressure look like right now?
Well, first of all, people need to realize governments don't create change, they respond to change. And many of these problems you're seeing in the media, lack of water, there's solutions for them. The government's just choosing not to do it because they don't think that the voters care. But I'm going to tell you something. You remember with the 215 children in unmarked graves that happened in Kamloops? Well, in the 6 weeks following that, the federal government implemented more TRC calls to action than in the previous 6 years. Wow. So you getting out there and just saying you care about these kids.
And that was staying in the headlines too? And
that was, sustaining headlines, wearing orange shirts, doing all that things. And that is what we need.
Cindy, we're just scratching the surface with this topic, but what a privilege to have you here to discuss it with us. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
We'll be right back after this.
Thanks for watching. We've got lots more discussion and debates on everything from food and fashion to pop culture and current events. Don't forget to click like and subscribe.